What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Mr. McGuinty's How-To Guides. I'm your host, P. McG, and today we're going to be going over the installation of the COBB SF Intake and SF Airbox. Let's get to it. Tuning may be required after installing this product. Check your instructions for off-the-shelf map selection. Alright, tools required to complete this installation are an M2.5 Allen wrench, M3 Allen wrench, 8mm socket or nut driver, 10mm socket, 10mm open-ended wrench, 6-inch ratchet extension, Phillips head screwdriver, scissors, and a Sharpie. Okay, start by removing the two clips that hold the factory air ducts in place. I'm using a flathead screwdriver, but realistically you could actually just use your fingers. Once the clips have been removed, go ahead and remove the air duct. Alright, now using your ratchet, 6-inch extension, and 10mm socket, go ahead and remove the bolt that attaches the front portion of the airbox to the lower portion of the chassis. Be careful when you're removing the bolt because it's a really tight squeeze, so you can drop that bolt really easily. Now go ahead and unclip the mass airflow sensor from the rear portion of the airbox, which is attached to the intake tube. Next, using your 10mm open-ended wrench, go ahead and remove these two bolts, which holds the chassis to the airbox. Okay, once you've loosened up the bolts, you should be able to unspin them with your fingers. Keep in mind that you may have to push down on the airbox a little bit to actually get the bolts out. Now, continuing to use your 10mm open-ended wrench, go ahead and remove this bolt, which attaches the airbox to the chassis. Okay, go ahead and wiggle the bracket out, which will free the front half of the airbox. Next, loosen the hose clamp, which attaches the intake tube to the compressor inlet tube, using your 8mm socket. Next, remove the hoses from the guide couplers attached to the intake tube. Once this has been completed, move the mass airflow sensor wiring away from the intake tube. Next, you'll need to unclip the power steering hose from the base of the airbox. The space was far too tight to be able to fit the camera back there, so you will want to trace back the hose that the arrow is pointing to find the clip. Okay, now it's time to slide the neck of the OEM intake off of the compressor inlet tube. Once this has been completed, go ahead and unclip the rear half of the airbox from the front half of the airbox, separate, and remove. To achieve the best seal possible on the airbox, measure and cut the provided rubber strip as shown. With this section of the rubber, you will want to cut notches into it to allow it to conform to the bends of the metal. As you can see with the notches cut in the rubber, it bends much more easily, allowing it to conform to the contour of the metal. Once you're done, the airbox should look like this. Okay, before you say goodbye to your factory airbox, you will need to remove the mass airflow sensor. Go ahead and use your Phillips head screwdriver to remove the mass airflow sensor from the rear portion of the airbox. Now be careful when removing the mass airflow sensor, as there is a rubber gasket on the inside that keeps it in place, and you don't want to damage that because it creates a seal inside of the intake tube. Alright, and now time for the fun part. Go ahead and take your mass airflow sensor, slide it into the mass airflow housing. You may have to push down a little bit on this to get it in place because of the rubber O-ring. Now using your M3 Allen screws, go ahead and secure the mass airflow sensor to the mass airflow housing. Now take the mass airflow housing and slide the lip of it into the air filter. Okay, now using an 8mm socket, go ahead and secure the hose clamp which attaches the mass airflow sensor housing to the air filter. Once this has been completed, go ahead and grab your hose clamps and loosely secure them to the silicone intake tube. Now take the silicone intake tube and slip it over the end of the mass airflow housing. Okay, and finally secure the center hose clamp. Once completed, your intake should look like this. Now remove the 10mm bolt holding the front of the power steering reservoir in place. Now, as indicated by the green arrows, reinstall the two 10mm bolts attaching the bracket to the chassis using your 10mm open-ended wrench. Okay, now that the prep work is done, it's time to install the airbox. When installing the airbox, you need to make sure that the mass airflow bracket actually slips underneath the airbox, and the bolt holes line up as indicated by the green arrow. Also make sure that your mass airflow sensor wiring is laying in the well directly behind the headlight. Now keep in mind that while you're doing the install of the airbox, you're going to be attempting to align 3 holes across 3 different planes: the power steering reservoir, the chassis, and the bracket that attaches to the chassis. It's okay for these to have loose fitment. The main concern is the lower chassis bolt, which is where the mass airflow bracket will be attaching as well. The 3 locations are indicated in the circles. Now grab a hold of your mass airflow sensor bracket and slide it underneath the airbox. Line up the bolt holes. This may take a little bit of finagling, but shouldn't be too terrible. Next, go ahead and finger tighten the 16mm long 10mm bolt and washer to the lower portion of the chassis, loosely securing the airbox and mass airflow bracket. Now using your ratchet, 6-inch extension, and 10mm socket, go ahead and tighten down the bolt. Now go ahead and check the fitment of the 2 remaining bolt locations. Now using your 10mm socket, go ahead and install the 20mm long 10mm bolt and washer back into the power steering reservoir bracket. Now using your 16mm long 10mm bolt, nut, and washer, reattach the front tab of the airbox to the chassis bracket, making sure that the airbox is on the outside of the chassis bracket. Because of how tight the space is, you may find it easier to use a 10mm box wrench on one end and a 10mm socket on the other. Alright, it's finally time to install the intake. Aim it as shown, and this will greatly help shoehorn it onto the compressor inlet tube. Once it's on, rotate as shown, being careful not to hit any of the brackets that hold the cover in place. Now gently push the neck of the intake down into the mass airflow bracket. Now go ahead and shimmy the intake back until it reaches the stopper on the compressor inlet tube. Now attach the mass airflow housing to the mass airflow bracket using the two supplied silver 10mm bolts, washers, and block washers. Now repeat this process for the other side. Now you want to tighten down your 8mm hose clamps in their final position. Now reattach the mass airflow sensor. Now go ahead and put the factory air duct in place, but do not install it yet. This must be in place before the airbox lid is installed. Now put the airbox lid in place and line up the bolt holes. Once you've got a line, go ahead and install the M2.5 button head hex bolts and M2.5 nylon washers using the provided M2.5 Allen wrench. Once all the bolts are in place, go back and tighten them up. And finally, reinstall the clips holding the factory air duct in place. This concludes the installation, but I highly recommend you stick around for sound bites and the post-installation product review. Okay, this product received high marks in the following categories. Superior airflow. There's literally no comparison between the OEM airbox and the COBB intake. The performance gains after the ECU has been remapped, I repeat, after the ECU has been remapped, are substantial. Next up is the sound. I mean, it just sounds wicked. It's like having a mini hurricane underneath the hood of your car. Another great feature is that it's cleanable. So you don't have to have the air filter replaced, you just need to clean it. Pull it out, rinse it off, re-oil, throw it back in, and you're golden. And finally is its price. It's priced right, comparable to other manufacturers, but it's made by COBB, so you know it was done right. Don't forget to stop by www.cobbtuning.com for more great products by COBB. And finally, don't forget to stop by and check us out on YouTube. Take it easy, everybody, and we'll see you next install.